I'll see you. Hey, everybody. This is a me reading section 4 of chapter 1 of Capital Volume 1, which is titled The Fetishism of the Commodity and Its Secret. So, here we go. A commodity appears at first sight as an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that the commodity is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So far as a commodity is a use value, there is nothing mysterious about the commodity. Whether we consider the commodity from the point of view that by its properties the commodity satisfies human needs, or that it takes first on these properties as the product of human labor, it is absolutely clear that, by his activity, man changes the forms of the materials of nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered if a table is made out of the form of wood. Nevertheless, the table continues to be wood, an ordinary sensuous thing. But as soon as the table emerges as a commodity, the table changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness. The table not only stands with the table's feet on the ground, but, in relation to all other commodities, the table stands on the table's head, and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas, far more wonderful than if the table were to begin dancing of the table's own free will. Footnote: one may recall that China and the tables began to dance when the rest of the world appeared to be standing still. Pour encourager les ut. Don't know if I'm saying that right. End footnote. The mystical character of the commodity does not therefore arise from the commodity's use value. Just as little does the mystical character of the commodity proceed from the nature of the determinants of value. For in the first place, however, varied the useful kinds of labor or productive activities, it is a physiological fact that the varied useful kinds of labor are functions of the human organism, and that each such function, whatever may be that function's nature or that function's form, is essentially the expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscles, and sense organs. Secondly, with regard to the foundation of the quantitative determination of value, namely the duration of that expenditure or the quantity of labor, this is quite palpably different from its quality. In all situations, the labor time it costs to produce the means of subsistence must necessarily concern mankind, although not to the same degree at different stages of development. And finally, as soon as men start to work for each other in any way, men's labor also assumes a social form. Footnote: among the ancient Germans, the size of a piece of land was measured according to the labor of a day. Hence the acre was called a Tagwerk, Tagvana, Jornala or Terra Jornalis, or Diurnalis. Maanwerk, Manskraft, Mansmaar, Manshouwat, etc. See George Ludwig von Maurer, Einleitung zur Geschichte der Mark, Hof ist Verfassung. End footnote. And finally, as soon as whence, then, arises the enigmatic character of the product of labor as soon as the product of labor assumes the form of a commodity. Clearly, the enigmatic character of the product of labor, as soon as it assumes the form of a commodity, arises from the form of the commodity itself. The equality of the kinds of human labor takes on a physical form in the equal objectivity of the products of labor as values. The measure of the expenditure of human labor power by human labor power's duration takes on the form of the magnitude of value of the products of labor. And finally, the relationships between the producers, within which the social characteristics of the producers' labors are manifested, take on the form of a social relation between the products of labor. The mysterious character of the commodity form consists therefore simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the products of labor themselves, as the socio-natural properties of these things. Footnote. To encourage, quote, the others, end quote. I don't know what this is in reference to, actually. It's a footnote that I missed. A reference to the simultaneous emergence in the 1850s of the Taiping Revolt in China and the craze for spiritualism which swept over upper-class German society. The rest of the world was, quote, standing still, end quote. Oh, this is a reference to, this is a footnote to the footnote. The rest of the world was, quote, standing still, end quote, in the period of reaction immediately after the defeat of the 1848 revolutions. End footnote. So let me return to the text. The mysterious character of the commodity form consists therefore simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the products of labor themselves, as the socio-natural properties of these things. Hence it also reflects the social relation of the producers to the sum total of labor as a social relationship between objects, a relation which exists apart from and outside the producers. Through this substitution, the products of labor become commodities, sensuous things which are at the same time supra, S-U-P-R-A, sensible or social. In the same way, the impression made by a thing on the optic nerve is perceived not as a subjective excitation of that nerve, but as the objective form of a thing outside the eye. In the act of seeing, of course, light is really transmitted from one thing, the external object, to another thing, the eye. It is a physical relation between physical things. As against this, the commodity form and the value relation of the products of labor within which the commodity form appears have absolutely no connection with the physical nature of the commodity and the material (dinglich) and relations arising out of this. It is nothing but the definite social relation between men themselves which assumes here, for them, the fantastic form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must take flight into the misty realm of religion. There the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures, endowed with a life of their own, which enter into relations both with each other and with the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. I call this the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labor as soon as the products of labor are produced as commodities. and is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. As the foregoing analysis has already demonstrated, this fetishism of the world of commodities arises from the peculiar social character of the labor which produces the world of commodities, or produces commodities. Like I said, I'm trying to follow like I've said in other videos, if you've listened to me before, I try to follow the pronouns or of things. So if it says like he, I try to re-say the person's name just so I personally don't get lost in it. And the same thing applies here. So when things say like it and they and he or whatever, I try to follow it. That doesn't mean I couldn't ever get it wrong, so be careful. You have to read the thing for yourself if you're trying to be like real badass Marx scholar. Objects of utility become commodities only because objects of utility are the products of the labor of private individuals who work independently of each other. The sum total of the labor of all these private individuals forms the aggregate labor of society. Since the producers do not come into social contact until the producers exchange the products of the producer's labor, the specific social characteristics of the producer's private labors appear only within this exchange. In other words, the labor of the private individual manifests itself as an element of the total labor of society only through the relations which the act of exchange establishes between the products, and through the products' mediation between the producers. To the producers, therefore, the social relations between the producers' private labors appear as what the social relations between their private labors are, i.e., the social relations between the producers' private labors appear not as direct social relations between persons in those persons' work, but rather as material (dinglich) and relations between persons and social relations between things. It is only by being exchanged that the products of labor acquire a socially uniform objectivity as values, which is distinct from the products of labor's sensuously varied objectivity as articles of utility. This division of the product of labor into a useful thing and a thing possessing value appears in practice only when exchange has already acquired a sufficient extension and importance to allow useful things to be produced for the purpose of being exchanged, so that their character as values has already to be taken into consideration during production. From this moment on, the labor of the individual producer acquires a twofold social character. On the one hand, the labor of the individual producer must, as a definite useful kind of labor, satisfy a definite social need, and thus maintain its position as an element of the total labor, as a branch of the social division of labor, which originally sprang up spontaneously. On the other hand, it can satisfy the manifold needs of the individual producer himself only insofar as every particular kind of useful private labor can be exchanged with, i.e., counts as the equal of, every other kind of useful private labor. Equality in the full sense between different kinds of labor can be arrived at only if we abstract from the different kinds of labor's real inequality, if we reduce the different kinds of labor to the characteristic the different kinds of labor have in common, that of being the expenditure of human labor power, of human labor in the abstract. The private producer's brain reflects this twofold character of the private producer's labor only in the forms which appear in practical intercourse, in the exchange of products. Hence the socially useful character of the private producer's private labor is reflected in the form that the product of labor has to be useful to others, and the social character of the equality of various kinds of labor is reflected in the form of the common character, as values, possessed by these materially different things, the products of labor. Men do not, therefore, bring the products of their labor into relation with each other as values, because men see these objects merely as the material integuments of homogeneous human labor. The reverse is true. By equating the products of labor, by equating their different products to each other in exchange as values, men equate men's different kinds of labor as human labor. Men do this without being aware of it. Footnote. Therefore, when Galliani said, quote, value is a relation between persons, he ought to have added a relation concealed beneath a material shell. End footnote. Value, therefore, does not have value's description branded on value's forehead. Rather, value transforms every product of labor into a social hieroglyphic. Later on, men try to decipher the hieroglyphic to get behind the secret of men's own social product. For the characteristic which objects of utility have of being values is as much men's social product as is their language. The belated scientific discovery that the products of labor, insofar as the products of labor are values, are merely the material expressions of the human labor expended to produce them, marks an epoch in the history of mankind's development, but by no means banishes the semblance of objectivity possessed by the social characteristics of labor, something which is only valid for this particular form of production, the production of commodities, namely the fact that the specific social character of private labor the specific social character of private labors carried on independently of each other consists in their equality as human labor, and, in the product, assumes the form of the existence of value, appears to those caught up in the relations of commodity production, and this is true both before and after the above-mentioned scientific discovery, to be just as ultimately valid as the fact that the scientific dissection of the air into the air's component parts left the atmosphere itself unaltered in the atmosphere's physical configuration. What initially concerns producers, in practice, when producers make an exchange, is how much of some other product they get for their own. In what proportions can the products be exchanged? As soon as these proportions have attained a certain customary stability, these proportions appear to result from the nature of the products, so that, for instance, 1 ton of iron and 2 ounces of gold appear to be equal in value, in the same way as a pound of gold and a pound of iron are equal in weight, despite their different physical and chemical properties. The value character of the product of labor becomes firmly established only when they act as magnitudes of value. These magnitudes vary continually, independently of the will, foreknowledge, and actions of the exchangers. These magnitudes own movement within society has for them the form of a movement made by things, and these things, far from being under their control, in fact control them. The production of commodities must be fully developed before the scientific conviction emerges from experience itself that all the different kinds of private labor, which are carried on independently of each other, and yet, as spontaneously developed branches of the social division of labor, are in a situation of all-round dependence on each other, are continually being reduced to the quantitative proportions in which society requires them. The reason for this reduction is that, in the midst of the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time socially necessary to produce them asserts itself as a regulative law of nature, in the same way the law of gravity asserts itself when a person's house collapses on top of him. Footnote. Quote, what are we to think of a law which can only assert itself through periodic crises? It is just a natural law which depends on the lack of awareness of the people who undergo it. End quote. Engels. Umrisse zu einer Kritik der Nationalökonomie in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, edited by Arnold Ruger and Karl Marx, Paris, 1844. English translation, The Marx Engels Collected Works, Volume 3, published in London, 1975. End footnote. Where the hell am I? The determination of the magnitude, end footnote, the determination of the magnitude of value by labor time is therefore a secret hidden from the apparent movements in the relative values of commodities. The determination of the magnitude of value by labor time's discovery destroys the semblance of the merely accidental determination of the magnitude of value of the products of labor, and by no means abolishes that determination's material form. Reflection on the forms of human life, hence also scientific analysis of those forms of human life, takes a course directly opposite to the forms of human life's real development. Reflection begins post festum, or after the feast, i.e. after the events reflected on have taken place, and therefore with the results of the process of development ready to hand. The forms which stamp products as commodities, and which are therefore the preliminary requirements for the circulation of commodities, already possesses the fixed quality of natural forms of social life before man seeks to give an account, not of these forms' historical character, for in his eyes they are immutable, but of their content and meaning. Consequently, it was solely the analysis of the prices of commodities which led to the determination of the magnitude of value, and solely the common expression of all commodities in money, which led to the establishment of the commodity of. Consequently, it was solely the analysis of the prices of commodities which led to the determination of the magnitude of value, and solely the common expression of all commodities in money, which led to the establishment of their character as values. It is, however, precisely this finished form of the world of commodities, the money form, which conceals the social character of private labor and the social relations between the individual workers, by making those relations appear as relations between material objects instead of revealing them plainly. If I state that coats or boots stand in a relation to linen, because linen is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, the absurdity of the statement is self-evident. Nevertheless, when the producers of coats and boots bring these commodities into relation with linen, or with gold or silver, and this makes no difference here, as the universal equivalent, the relation between their own private labor and the collective labor of society appears to them in exactly this absurd form. The categories of bourgeois economics consist precisely of forms of this kind. The categories of bourgeois economics are forms of thought, which are socially valid and therefore objective, for the relations of production belong to this historically determined mode of social production, i.e. commodity production. The whole mystery of commodities, all the magic and necromancy that surrounds the products of labor on the basis of commodity production, vanishes therefore as soon as we come to other forms of production. As political economists are fond of Robinson Crusoe stories, let us first look at Robinson on his island. Footnote: even Ricardo has his Robinson Crusoe stories. Quote, Ricardo makes his primitive fishermen and private hunter into owners of commodities, who immediately exchange their fish and game in proportion to the labor time which is materialized in these exchange values. On this occasion, Ricardo slips into the anachronism of allowing the primitive fisherman and hunter to calculate the value of their implements in accordance with the annuity tables used on the London Stock Exchange in 1817. Apart from bourgeois society, the, quote, parallelogram of Mr. Owen, end quote, seemed to have been the only form of society Ricardo was acquainted with, end quote. Karl Marx, Sur Critique. I'm guessing that's a contribution to the critique of political economy. Not sure, but I think he's quoting himself in that piece. Capital was published in 1867. A contribution to the critique of political economy was published 8 years earlier in 1859. Here we are. End footnote. Undemanding though Robinson is by nature, Robinson still has needs to satisfy. Robinson still has needs to satisfy, and must therefore perform useful labors of various kinds. Robinson must make tools, knock together furniture, tame llamas, fish, hunt, and so on. Of course, Robinson's prayers, of Robinson's prayers and the like, we take no account here, since our friend takes pleasure in his prayers and the like, and sees his prayers and the like as recreation. Despite the diversity of Robinson's productive functions, Robinson knows that his productive functions are only different forms of activity of one and the same Robinson, hence only different modes of human labor. Necessity itself compels Robinson to divide Robinson's time with precision between Robinson's different functions. Whether one occupies a greater space in Robinson's total activity than another function depends on the magnitude of the difficulties to be overcome in attaining the useful effect aimed at. Our friend Robinson Crusoe learns this by experience, and having saved a watch, ledger, ink, and pen from the shipwreck, Robinson's stockbook contains a catalog. Our friend Robinson Crusoe learns this by experience, and having saved a watch, ledger, ink, and pen from the shipwreck, he soon begins, like a good Englishman, to keep a set of books. Robinson's stockbook contains a catalog of the useful objects Robinson possesses, of the various operations necessary for those useful objects' production, and finally of the labor time that specific quantities of these products have on average cost him. All the relations between Robinson and these objects that form Robinson's self-created wealth are here so simple and transparent that even Mr. Sedley Taylor could understand them. Footnote. The original German here has Herr M. Wert, chosen by Marx as a run-of-the-mill vulgar economist and propagandist familiar to German readers. Engels introduced Mr. Sedley Taylor, a Cambridge Don against whom he polemicized in his preface to the fourth German edition. End footnote. And yet those relations cannot contain all the essential determinants of value. Let us now transport ourselves from Robinson's Island, bathed in light, to medieval Europe, shrouded in darkness. Here, instead of the independent man, we find everyone dependent: serfs and lords, vassals and suzerains, laymen and clerics. Personal dependence characterizes the social relations of material production as much as personal dependence characterizes the other spheres of life based on that production. But precisely because relations of personal dependence form the given social foundation, there is no need for labor and labor's products to assume a fantastic form different from their reality. They take the shape in the transactions of society, of services in kind and payments in kind. The natural form of labor, labor's particularity, and not, as in a society based on commodity production, its universality, the form of labor's universality, is here labor's immediate social form. Hold on, I'm trying to follow that again. But precisely because relations of dependence form the given social foundation, there is no need for labor and labor's products to assume a fantastic form different from labor and labor's products' reality. Labor and labor's products take the shape, in the transactions of society, of services in kind and payments in kind. The natural form of labor, labor's particularity, and not, as in a society based on commodity production, labor's universality, is here its immediate social form. The corvée can be measured by time just as well as the labor which produces commodities. But every serf knows that what he expends in the service of his lord is a specific quantity of his own personal labor power. The tithe owed to the priest is more clearly apparent than his blessing. Whatever we may think, then, of the different roles in which money confront each other in such a society, the social relations between individuals in the performance of individuals' labor appear at all events as individuals' own personal relations, and are not disguised as social relations between things, between the products of labor. For an example of labor in common, i.e. directly associated labor, we do not need to go back to the spontaneously developed form which we find at the threshold of the history of all civilized peoples. Footnote, quote, "A ridiculous notion has spread abroad recently that communal property, in communal properties, natural spontaneous form is specifically Slav, indeed exclusively Russian. In fact, communal property is the primitive form that we can prove to have existed among Romans, Teutons, and Celts, and which indeed still exists to this day in India, in a whole range of diverse patterns, albeit sometimes only as remnants. A more exact study of the Asiatic, and specifically of the Indian form of communal property, would indicate the way in which different forms of spontaneous, primitive communal property give rise to different forms of its dissolution. Thus, the different original types of Roman and Germanic private property can be deduced from the different forms of Indian communal property." End quote. Marx, Sur Critique. End footnote. We have one nearer to hand in the patriarchal rural industry of a peasant family, which produces corn, cattle, yarn, linen, and clothing for that peasant family's own use. These things, corn, cattle, yarn, linen, and clothing, confront the family as so many products of the family's collective labor. But these things do not confront each other as commodities. The different kinds of labor which create these products, such as tilling the fields, tending the cattle, spinning, weaving, and making clothes, are already in their natural form social functions, for they are functions of the family, which, just as much as a society based on commodity production, possesses the family's, own spontaneously developed division of labor. The distribution of labor within the family and the labor time expended by the individual members of the family are regulated by differences of sex and age, as well as by seasonal variations in the natural conditions of labor. The fact that the expenditure of the individual labor powers is measured by duration appears here, by its very nature, as a social characteristic of labor itself, because the individual labor powers, by the individual labor power's very nature, act only as instruments of the joint labor power of the family. Let us finally imagine, for a change, an association of free men. So close. Working with the means of production held in common, and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force. All the characteristics of Robinson's labor are repeated here, but with the difference that they are social instead of individual. All Robinson's products were exclusively the result of Robinson's own personal labor, and all Robinson's products were therefore directly objects of utility for Robinson personally. The total product of our imagined association is a social product. One part of this product serves as fresh means of production and remains social, but another part is consumed by the members of the association as means of subsistence. The part consumed by the members of the association as means of subsistence must therefore be divided amongst the members of the association. The way this division is made will vary with the particular kind of social organization of production and the corresponding level of social development attained by the producers. We shall assume, but only for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. Labor time would in that case play a double part. Labor time's apportionment in accordance with a definite social plan maintains the correct proportion between the different functions of labor and the various needs of the associations. Plural there. On the other hand, labor time also serves as a measure of the part taken by each individual in the common labor, and of his share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producer, both towards their labor and the products of their labor, are here transparent in their simplicity, in production as well as in distribution. 1 second. Back to the text, sorry about that. For a society of commodity producers, whose general social relation of production consists in the fact that they treat their products as commodities, hence as values, and in this material, sachlich form bring the commodity producers, individual private laborers into relation with each other as homogeneous human labor. Christianity, with its religious cult of man in the abstract, more particularly in its bourgeois development, i.e. in Protestantism, deism, etc., is the most fitting form of religion. In the ancient Asiatic, classical, antique, and other such modes of production, the transformation of the product into a commodity, and therefore men's existence as producers of commodities, plays a subordinate role, which however increases in importance as these communities approach nearer and nearer to the stage of their dissolution. Trading nations, properly so called, exist only in the interstices of the ancient world, like the gods of Epicurus in the Intermundia, or Jews in the pores of Polish society. Footnote: according to the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BC, the gods existed only in the Intermundia, or spaces between different worlds, and had no influence on the course of human affairs. Very few of the writings of Epicurus have been preserved in the original Greek, and this particular idea survived only by being included in Cicero, De Natura Deorum, Book 1, Section 18. End footnote. These ancient social organisms of production are much more simple and transparent than those of bourgeois society. But those ancient social organisms of production are founded either on the immaturity of man as an individual, when he has not yet torn himself loose from the umbilical cord of his natural species connection with other men, or on direct relations of dominance and servitude. They are conditioned by a low stage of development of the productive powers of labor and correspondingly limited relations between men within the process of creating and reproducing their material life. Hence also limited relations between man and nature. These real limitations are reflected in the ancient worship of nature and in other elements of tribal religions. The religious reflections of the real world can, in any case, vanish only when the practical relations of everyday life between man and nature generally present themselves to him in a transparent and rational form. The veil is not removed from the countenance of the social life process, i.e. the process of material production, until it becomes production by freely associated men. All right, I'm counting that one. That's me. Freely associated men. That's close enough, huh? And stands under their conscious and planned control. This, however, requires that society possesses a material foundation, or a series of material conditions of existence, which in their turn are the natural and spontaneous product of a long and tormented historical development. Political economy has indeed analyzed value and its value's magnitude, however incompletely, and has uncovered the content concealed within these forms. But it has never once asked the question why this content has assumed that particular form, that is to say, why labor is expressed in value, and why the measure of labor by labor's duration is expressed in the magnitude of value of the product. Footnote. Now this is a very long footnote, so the insufficiency of Ricardo's analysis of the magnitude of value, and Ricardo's analysis is by far the best, will appear from the third and fourth books of this work. Footnote. These are the books that appeared respectively as Volume 3 of Capital and in the 3 volumes of Theories of Surplus Value. End footnote. Within the footnote. As regards value in general, classical political economy, in fact, nowhere distinguishes explicitly and with a clear awareness between labor as labor appears in the value of a product and the same labor as that labor appears in the product's use value. Of course, the distinction is made in practice, since labor is treated sometimes from its quantitative aspect and at other times qualitatively. But it does not occur to the economist that a purely quantitative distinction between the kinds of labor presupposes their qualitative unity or equality, and therefore gives their reduction to abstract human labor. For instance, Ricardo declares that Ricardo agrees with Destutt de Tracy when Destutt de Tracy says, quote, "As it is certain that our physical and moral faculties are alone our original riches, the employment of those faculties, labor of some kind, is our original treasure, and it is always from this employment that all those things are created which we call riches." ... It is certain, too, that all those things only represent the labor which has created them, and if they have a value, or even two distinct values, they can only derive them from that, end quote. The value, quote, of the labor from which they emanate, end quote. Ricardo, The Principles of Political Economy. We would here only point out that Ricardo imposes his own more profound interpretation on the words of Destutt. Admittedly, Destutt does say that all things which constitute wealth, quote, represent the labor which has created them, end quote. But on the other hand, Destutt also says that all things which constitute wealth acquire their, quote, two different values, end quote, use value and exchange value, from, quote, the value of labor, end quote. Destutt thus falls into the commonplace error of the vulgar economists, assuming the value of one commodity, here labor, in order to, in turn, to use it to determine the values of other commodities. But Ricardo reads Destutt as if Destutt had said that labor, not the value of labor, is represented both in use value and in exchange value. Nevertheless, Ricardo himself makes so little of the dual character of the labor represented in this twofold way that Ricardo is forced to spend the whole of his chapter, Value and Riches, their distinctive properties, on a laborious examination of the trivialities of Jean-Baptiste Say. And at the end, Ricardo is therefore quite astonished to find that while Destutt agrees with him that labor is the source of value, he nevertheless also agrees with Say about the concept of value. Footnote, quote, "I am sorry to be obliged to say that M. de Tracy supports, by his authority, the definition which Monsieur Say has given to the words, quote, value, quote, riches, and, quote, utility, end quote. Ricardo." End footnote. End footnote. New footnote. It is one of the chief failings of classical political economy that it has never succeeded, by means of classical political economy's analysis of commodities, and in particular of commodities' value, in discovering the form of value which in fact turns value into exchange value. Even classical political economy's best representatives, Adam Smith and Ricardo, treat the form of value as something of indifference, something external to the nature of the commodity itself. The explanation for this is not simply that their attention is entirely absorbed by the analysis of the magnitude of value. It lies deeper. The value form of the product of labor is the most abstract, but also the most universal form of the bourgeois mode of production. By that fact, it stamps the bourgeois mode of production as a particular kind of social production of a historical and transitory character. If if then we make the mistake of treating it as the eternal natural form of social production, we necessarily overlook the specificity of the value form and consequently of the commodity form together with its further developments. The money form, the capital form, etc. We therefore find that economists who were entirely agreed that labor time is the measure of the magnitude of value have the strangest and most contradictory ideas about money, that is, about the universal equivalent in its finished form. This emerges sharply when the economists deal with banking, where the commonplace definitions of money will no longer hold water. Hence there has arisen in opposition to the classical economist a restored mercantilist system, Ganiel, etc., which sees in value only the social form, or rather values insubstantial semblance. Let me point out once and for all that by classical political economy, I mean all the economists who since the time of William Petty have investigated the real internal framework Zusammenhang of bourgeois relations of production, as opposed to the vulgar economists who only flounder around within the apparent framework of those relations, ceaselessly ruminate on the materials long since provided by scientific political economy, and seek their plausible explanation of the crudest phenomena for the domestic purposes of the bourgeoisie. Apart from this, the vulgar economists confine themselves to systematizing in a pedantic way and proclaiming for everlasting truths the banal and commonplace notions held by the bourgeois agents of production about the bourgeois agents of production's own world, which is to them the best possible world. End footnote. These formulas, which bear the unmistakable stamp of belonging to a social formation in which the process of production has mastery over man instead of the opposite, appear to the political economist's bourgeois consciousness to be as much a self-evident and nature-imposed necessity as productive labor itself. Hence, the pre-bourgeois forms of the social organization of production are treated by political economy in much the same way the fathers of the church treated pre-Christian religions. Footnote. Quote, the economists have a singular way of proceeding. For the economists, there are only two kinds of institutions, artificial and natural. The institutions feudalism are artificial institutions. Those of the bourgeoisie are natural institutions. In this they resemble the theologians, who likewise establish two kinds of religion. Every religion which is not theirs is an invention of men, while their own is an emanation of God, ... Thus there has been history, but there is no longer any. End quote. Marx, Mesure de la philosophie, Réponse à la philosophie de la misère des imprudents, 1847. Footnote. English translation, Karl Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy, London, 1966. End footnote. Truly comical is M. Bastiat, who imagines that the ancient Greeks and Romans lived by plunder alone. For if people live by plunder for centuries, there must, after all, always be something there to plunder. In other words, the objects of plunder must be continually reproduced. It seems, therefore, that even the Greeks and the Romans had a process of production, hence an economy, which constituted the material basis of their world, as much as the bourgeois economy constitutes that of the present-day world. Or perhaps Bastiat means that a mode of production, based on the labor of slaves, is based on a system of plunder. In that case, Bastiat is on dangerous ground. If a giant thinker like Aristotle could err in his evaluation of slave labor, why should a dwarf economist like Bastiat be right in his evaluation of wage labor. I seize this opportunity of briefly refuting an objection made by a German-American publication to my work Sur Critique der politischen Ökonomie, 1859. My view is that each particular mode of production and the relations of production corresponding to that mode of production at each given moment, in short, quote, the economic structure of society, end quote, is, quote, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which corresponds definite forms of social consciousness, end quote, and that, quote, the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life, end quote. Footnote. These passages are taken from the preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy written in January 1859. End footnote. In the opinion of the German-American publication, this is all very true for our own times, in which material interests are preponderant, but not for the Middle Ages, dominated by Catholicism, or for Athens and Rome, dominated by politics. In the first place, it strikes us as odd that anyone should suppose that these well-worn phrases about the Middle Ages and the ancient world were unknown to anyone else. One thing is clear. The Middle Ages could not live on Catholicism, nor could the ancient world on politics. On the contrary, it is the manner in which they gained their livelihood, which explains why in one case politics, in the other case Catholicism, played the chief part. For the rest, one needs no more than a slight acquaintance with, for example, the history of the Roman Republic, to be aware that its secret history is the history of landed property. And then there is Don Quixote, who long ago paid the penalty for wrongly imagining that knight-errantry was compatible with all economic forms of society. End footnote. The degree to which some economists are misled by the fetishism attached to the world of commodities, or by the objective appearance of the social characteristics of labor, is shown, among other things, by the dull and tedious dispute over the part played by nature in the formation of exchange value. Since exchange value is a definite social manner of expressing the labor bestowed on a thing, exchange value can have no more natural content than has, for example, the rate of exchange. As the commodity form is the most general and the most undeveloped form of bourgeois production, the commodity form makes its appearance at an early date, though not in the same predominant and therefore characteristic manner as nowadays. Hence the commodity form's fetish character is still relatively easy to penetrate. But when we come to more concrete forms, even this appearance of simplicity vanishes. Where did the illusions of the monetary system come from? The adherents of the monetary system did not see gold and silver as representing money as a social relation of production, but in the form of natural objects with peculiar social properties. And what of modern political economy, which looks down so disdainfully on the monetary system? Does not its fetishism become quite palpable when it deals with capital? How long is it since the disappearance of the physiocratic illusion that ground rent grows out of the soil, not out of society? But, to avoid anticipating, we will content ourselves here with one more example relating to the commodity form itself. If commodities could speak, commodities would say this: our use value may interest men, but our use value does not belong to us as objects. What does belong to us as objects, however, is our value. Our own intercourse as commodities proves it. We relate to each other merely as exchange values. Now listen to how those commodities speak through the mouths of the economist. Quote, value, i.e., exchange value, is a property of things, riches, i.e., use value, in parentheses, of man, So let me repeat that whole quote because I should say the parentheses, right? Quote, value, parenthesis, i.e. exchange value, end parenthesis, is a property of things. Riches, parenthesis, i.e. use value, end parenthesis, of man. Value, in this sense, necessarily implies exchanges. Riches do not, end quote. I don't know if it has a name, but it says, observations on some verbal disputes in political economy, particularly relating to value and to supply and demand. End footnote. Quote, riches, parenthesis, use value, end parenthesis, are the attribute of man. Value is the attribute of commodities. A man or a community is rich. A pearl or a diamond is valuable. ... A pearl or diamond is valuable as a pearl or diamond, end quote. Samuel Bailey. So far, no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or diamond. The economists who have discovered this chemical substance and who lay special claim to critical acumen nevertheless find that the use value of material objects belongs to them independently of their material properties. While the economists who have discovered this chemical substance, exchange value, and who lay special claim to critical acumen, nevertheless find that the use value of material objects belongs to material objects independently of the material object's material properties, while the material object's value, on the other hand, forms a part of these material objects as objects. What confirms the economists in this view is the peculiar circumstance that the use value of a thing is realized without exchange, i.e., in the direct relation between the thing and man, while inversely, a thing's value is realized only in exchange, i.e., in a social process. Who would not call to mind at this point the advice given by the good Dogberry to the night watchman Seacole? Footnote, in Shakespeare's comedy Much Ado About Nothing, Act 3, Scene 3. End footnote. Quote, to be a well-favored man is the gift of fortune, but reading and writing comes by nature, end quote. Footnote. Both the author of Observations, etc., and Samuel Bailey accuse Ricardo of converting exchange value from something relative into something absolute. The reverse is true. Ricardo has reduced the apparent relativity which these things, diamonds, pearls, etc., possess, to the true relation hidden behind the appearance, namely their relativity as mere expressions of human labor. If the followers of Ricardo answer Bailey somewhat rudely, but by no means convincingly, this is because the followers of Ricardo are not unable to find in Ricardo's own works any elucidation of the interconnection between value and the form of value, or exchange value. That's interesting. Interconnection between value and the form of value, or exchange value. What is the relation between value and exchange value? It's very interesting. But that's the end. Thank you so much for listening.